welcome to Otherworldly, the Changing Times, Changing Worlds weekly. It's not a podcast. My children tell me this is not called a podcast. It's a show. Anyway, and tonight, as we are entering the holiday season, we have Jane Sibley, who is one of the founders of the Changing Times, Changing Worlds Conference. And she's an author of some books that run from very scholarly to a lot of fun, like The Divine Thunderbolt and Norse Mythology According to Uncle Einar. And she is going to talk tonight about the Oskoreia, which I am sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, and other Norse winter traditions, because in the old days, Yule was not just fun and games. So Jane, I'd like to start it off by asking you for A, the pronunciation, and B, what's the translation of Oskoreia?
Okay. Oskoreia, you pronounce it properly. You got it.
You've been working on me.
And it's also called Asgarsreið, Asgarsreið, which means the ride of the Aesir. And the Oskoreia happened when the big storms are coming in November and early December, which would be now, and they'd be coming in from the Atlantic Ocean and heading in. They'd slam into Scandinavia and also the continent and England. And the Oskoreia itself may have originated in Germanic lands, but also then in Scandinavia, when all of a sudden, Odin was more codified, but still not the Odin of Snorri Sturluson. Now, it probably was late Vendel or early Viking period when it really started going. And Odin, or Wod, or Wut, the German Wut, W-U-T, meant rage or fury. And so, or the Gothic Wods, which meant possessed or berserk and totally out of control, because Odin could do things like that. And so he was the leader of the wild hunt. And it was called the wild hunt also. So he was the one that called up the howling winds and the furor, literally, that would just sweep across the country. And so these were these gale force storm winds, particularly at night. And so Wod, or Odin, or Odan, or Wotan, was accompanied usually by Frigga, or Frigg, who was his wife, who was also called Frau Holle, or Persta, down south more. And she rode a staff, or a sort of a what's that thing called that you have the yarn on?
Distaff.
Distaff, yes.
Distaff.
And the distaff, the fluffy end was in front. Now, this could also resemble a certain portion of a male anatomy. And later times, in Christian times, the distaff was reversed so that this fluffy end was behind the rider, which is how come the modern witch would have the broom with the bristles in the back. But originally, they were in front. Now, Odin would be riding particularly is in the dark times. And sometimes he could have been on Sleipnir, but Sleipnir, that 8-legged gray stallion, came along later. But he sometimes rode a wolf, sometimes rode just, he was able to just somehow go. And just you just didn't want to, if you saw this coming, you hear the wind start to pick up, you wanted to be inside your house. If you were caught outside, you would want to dive into a ditch or something and pretend to be asleep or dead so that you wouldn't get picked up. Now, the winds would sometimes terrify animals. So in the morning, the following morning, if you saw that your horse was lathered or the cows were all lathered up and exhausted, obviously they had been picked up by the wild hunt and ridden by some of the beings that joined Lwyd or Wodan on the wild hunt, and then given back, and then they'd be just returned to their original place after the fun was over. Now, but this is the part of Odin, which was the furor in battle. This is different from Tyr, Tyr, who was a honor god. He was sort of like would have gotten the Medal of Honor, as it were. He was an honor god, whereas Odin or Wood, he had his own agenda, and sometimes he could be bribed. Now, it is possible that the wild hunt was originated, the concept and sort of personification into Wod or Wodan or Vut would be in Germanic lands and migrated up into Vendel and early Viking period Scandinavia, but also you find varieties of the wild hunt in other lands too. Now, the wild hunt would have, besides just plain Odin and Frigg, you would have other spirits or supernatural hunters that were joining, and they would be riding on various animals that would be picked up. Say if you left your horse outside or whatever, or they weren't protected by, say, the threshold magic in a barn, then they would be on the wild hunt. Now, the earliest description of this that we can get pretty much was Jakob Grimm in Deutsche Mythologie, or German Mythology, 1835. But it was collecting stories. And so some of these were obviously from the Germanic pagan tradition, but you find them throughout Northern, Western, and Central Europe. And so Grimm was the one that popularized the term of the wild hunt for this phenomenon, though it was called Oskoreia or Oskoreia in Scandinavia. Now, in the Germanic tradition, was also called wilde Jagd, as German means wild hunt or wild chase, furious chase, or wütendes Heer, the raging host, a raging army. And so you just wanted to avoid being around. This was scary. And sometimes, including Wodan, there would be a fellow called Knecht Ruprecht, which resembled the Krampus. And I wonder if the Krampus had anything to do because he shows up. And there was a female Krampus also. And so, but you see the Wild Hunt in a lot of post-medieval folklore. In England, it was called Herlathing, or Herla's Assembly, Woden's Hunt, or Herod's Hunt, because they're pulling from Christianity here, and Herod was from down south, or the Devil's Dandy Dogs in Cornwall, or Ghost Riders. Now, the Oskoreia was also called Odin's Jägeren, or Odin's Hunters. And so you find Odin's Jagd, or Odin's Hunt also, and the Wilde Jagden, the Wild Hunt. And in Sweden also, and I think also parts of Norway and Iceland, you had Guro Risserova, a Gudrun Horsetail, and who was huge and horrid, and she had a she rode a black horse called Skokse, Skokse. But we don't see too much of Guro, though there is a version of her in Iceland that has the Yule lads. I think there were 12 of them or something like that. And so there was pot liquor and door
13.
slammer and a whole bunch of those that would lead up. They were just sort of nuisancey. But you didn't want to deal with Guro. And then there was the Yule cat. That was another nasty one.
Yeah, he'd eat you if you didn't have a piece of new clothing.
What?
If you didn't have at least one piece of new clothing, the Yule cat was allowed to eat you.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
you better be good enough so somebody will give you a gift.
Yeah, and you might want to look up the Yule lads because they're really funny. There's some very funny pictures of them. In Welsh folklore, Gwyn ap Nudd, Gwynapnudd, was a wild huntsman riding a demon horse, hunting souls at night, along with a bunch of white-bodied and red-eared dogs of hell. Now we see white bodies and red ears also in the fairy cattle of that area of the world, and so he was thought to be the king of the underworld, who made sure that imprisoned devils did not destroy human souls. But once they were loose, they were looking. In France, they had, from Latin sources, we have Familia Hellequina, Familia Hellequini, and Hellequin was probably borrowed from Middle English Herla King, or Old Herla Kinning, by the Romance-speaking Normans, and so it would probably be, the old king. I'm not so hot on Anglo-Saxon, but you just didn't. And it was said that a hunter who hunted on Sunday, this is Christian times, was condemned to redeem himself by hunting during the wild hunt. And in West Slavic Central Europe, it was called Divoki Hon, Divok, with an accent over it, Gon. And there's a bunch of Russian words here that I don't know, essentially meaning the wild hunting party or the wild hunt. And so it was the infernal hunt, the old army, troop of ghosts, war company, deadly retinue, And there are many names for them. And in the Netherlands and Flanders, in northern Belgium, Wild Hunt was known as the Buck Riders. In the Dutch, it was a Bokkenrieders, and gangs of highwaymen would pretend to be these for their to their advantage in the 1700s. But the Wild Hunt was a very, very scary thing, and everybody knew. They could hear the wind starting to roar when things started coming, and so you just wanted to duck and hide. Do we have any questions at this point? I'm still going. Nope.
Lasta has asked if she might be able to see the Russian text at some point.
Let's see now if I can find the page. I'll hold this up here. See if I can. Oh. I'm trying to find where I had the Russian.
Mm.
Can you see that?
A little bit.
Show me later offline so we don't hold anybody up.
Yeah, you can see. You could always share a picture later.
Yeah, I'm not good on reading Cyrillic letters.
On the technology.
That too.
Now, and it was also thought that some of the ones that were in the Wild Hunt were unchristened people. Again, this is in Christian times. And particularly ones and women who had not been churched might be forced into this. When after you've had a baby, then you should go to church a certain time and take the child. So you'd make a lot of noise, and it was a scary, scary thing, and you just simply didn't want to get caught up in it. And so in the 19th century Europe, this really got spread around, and so things were added along the way. You know how in the modern New Age things get added and changed and whatever. But the Wild Hunt itself had pre-Christian origins, with the leading male being Wodan, who is not the Odin of Snorri, but a nasty fellow. And they were just looking for whatever they could scoop up as far as fellow riders. And Grimm said that it marched as an army, pretending outbreak of war. And now, see, Odin did like war, in the furor of the war. As a matter of fact, he was also deemed to be the equivalent of the owner of you heard of the Flying Dutchman, the ghost ship manned by skeletons, etc., that would scare people. And so if this ship came along, you would not look at it, you would not hail it, otherwise you would be caught up in it. So you just didn't. It was a scary thing, led by a god and goddesses. And let's see now. Flip notes. I've got so many notes here. Um, now, Persta or Frau Holle, the woman, the goddess that was right up there with Odin or Wodan, was also the one who, it was believed, when she shook out her feather bed, that's where snow came from. And so you would have the snow. And so that was a friendlier thing. And she was sort of very much she liked to have obedient children and household in order and stuff like that. But that was when she was not on the wild hunt. When she's on the wild hunt, she was just and they were all they were all out looking for prey. Like whoever was just out in the fields or whatever, animals or whatever, and it would to get caught up. So this was a scary time. And in Christian times, the hunter was also linked with either a dragon or the Christian devil. And usually riding a horse and with hounds or dogs with him. Moo! So the dogs would be out hunting. And in Germany, it was said that if you helped the hunt, you would get awarded the money or gold or a leg of a slain animal or human, and in such a way that you couldn't, but which is cursed in such a way you couldn't get rid of it. So you'd have to find a priest or a magician able to ban it or trick the wild hunt into taking the leg back by asking for salt, which the hunt cannot deliver. And so you would just want to stay clear. And it was said that you would also have a piece of bread and a piece of silver with you if you were out, because you could toss the bread to the dogs and the silver to the leader of the wild hunt. Maybe he'd overlook you. But but the wild hunt was essentially when the weather was changing. The harvest was over, and we're heading into Yule. And I'll get into some of the Yule traditions in a bit. But it was in Christian times, it was said that Odin was a nobleman or a king who had to hunt on Sundays because he had to hunt down and kill supernatural beings until the end of time. But if houses were built on former roads, they could be burned down because Odin didn't like to change his plans. He had a steady path. They had steady paths, so you would know where the wild hunt would go. You didn't have email back in those days, so you couldn't send out an alert, but people would just know when they could hear the weather starting to come and hear the trees start whipping and things that might sound like hounds mooing, which would be the winds howling. Now, in Britain, the Peterborough Chronicle, and this was written in 1127. Many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The huntsmen were black, huge, and hideous, and rode on black horses and on black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black with eyes like saucers, and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretched from that same town to Stamford, and in the night the monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. And so the wind can really sometimes sound like horns blowing. And they say there'd be 20 or 30 huntsmen or more, and the whole time where you'd be vulnerable to the Oskoreia would be up to 9 weeks. But that was according to some Christians. Usually in Scandinavia and Western Germanic and continental lands, it was essentially November and the first bit of December when you get the howling winds, and then you'll start getting the great snows. So you'll find also the myth of the wild hunt going into some of the King Arthur legends and in the Dartmoor folk legends. And so you'll have sort of things added along the way. It's like the King Arthur thing was added along the way. So essentially, this is the wild, untamed forces of nature in its dark and chthonic aspects. Now, was there any relationship to Santa Claus? Probably not, because Santa Claus, though he was an aerial traveler, the Dutch Christmas figure was Sinterklaas and Santa Claus, which had a long white beard and gray horse for nightly rides. But Santa Claus was more of a beneficent. He was the one that rewarded good children. And the not so good ones were supposed to get a lump of coal. Of course, any blacksmith would love the coal. Now, the reindeer, this would be come from Sami. They used to call them the laps, but lap in Norwegian means a tattered piece of cloth. And the modern dress of Santa Claus, the red with the white trim, comes from a Swedish artist who worked for Coca-Cola. So this is the Coca-Cola colors. Father Christmas before was clad in green. So, here we have things added on. Now, in modern Wicca, they all of a sudden put Hecate in there, and but this is modern in the 20th century, and that they would have a wild hunt challenge, so people would on Halloween, and you'd walk around a local area of woodland in the daytime, and repeating the task as a timed competition at night. And if completed successfully, that they'd gain the trust of the wood spirits, and they would be permitted to cut timber from the trees from which to make a staff. So, here we have things going on and on and on. But the original wild hunt was mostly a terrifying meteorological phenomenon, and people would, they just didn't want to be out in it. So this is a good time to stay home. Now, do we have any questions at this point? Because I'm going to start getting into some of the Yule traditions.
I just want to say I'm really, really enjoying this so far.
Well, we get storms.
I'm going to say, did you see the famous Oskoreia painting that we had as the header of the announcement, that had all of these weird creatures, including somebody seems to be wearing a bishop's mitre, and somebody's playing a fiddle on deer back, and stuff, that this was a traditional thing, painting. And I was just wondering, you could
think that's-
identify
that got-
any of the characters in that because it looks so cool.
Yeah, well, I think that's a painting called Oskoreia, or The Wild Hunt of Odin, 1872, painted by a fellow named Peter Nikolai Arbo. And I've got a picture of that too here.
Yeah. Oh, that's the scarier
I
version.
can either hold it up. It sort of looks like that.
He did several versions of that. He
Yeah.
really kept painting it over and over.
Well, this was a major theme this time of the year. They didn't have Halloween as we have it back then. Remember, the modern Halloween is fairly recent, as far as sort of holidays go.
Well, the commonality is that they were New Year celebrations. So Halloween
didn't have-
for the Celts was the New Year, and winter
Mhm.
solstice for the Germans and the Slavs was Christmas and the New Year.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it would be the winter solstice when the sun was at its lowest, and then when the day was coming back. This is when you're starting to celebrate bringing the new light. And so coming towards the solstice, this is when you had to kindle the new fire. And so this is Norwegian tradition. All the fires, including that in the smith's forge, would have to be quenched. Everything would have to be out. And then the smith would, by hammering on a piece of iron, usually consecrated for that purpose, piece of iron, and by the kinetic strokes, pounding on it, heating it up, and you would have char cloth, which was, let's see now. Yeah, okay. The char cloth, which was linen, which had been charred in like a tube on the forge. This was prepared ahead of time, and makes very good kindling. Also, you would have mistletoe, because that had been gathered at midsummer and so dried. And so when the piece of iron got hot enough to kindle something, you put a piece of char cloth or very flammable something else on it, and when it lit, you could have like a little, like essentially a toothpick with pine pitch on it, and you light that from that on the anvil, and then from there, you would build that fire. Then that would go to the smith's forge, which had dried mistletoe in it, as well as the some more char cloth. And so when the forge was lit, then all the villagers would come with unlit torches, and they could light their torches from the smith's forge and then carry that flame to their homes and to those who couldn't come. And there was a story that they couldn't get the new fire to ignite. And so then there was a big search around in town, and they found in the home of an old lady, in the toe of a wooden shoe, she had hidden a live coal, which was still burning. And as soon as that was quenched, then all of a sudden, the new fire could be lit. So this is echoing the rebirth of the sun. And so the fire would go, and you would have the Yule, which is one hell of a Christmas feast. And this is where you have game, you have all sorts of plenty of mead, and of course the smith would get into that. And so you will see the Yule. This is when you'd have you'd roast lamb ribs, and you would have, it was a very glorious feast, and it could last for almost a week until the food ran out and until people sobered up. It was a good time. But again, this is sort of a relief after the terror. I mean, Stephen King would probably write a really good novel on the Wild Hunt. But anyway, after the terrors of the Wild Hunt, all of a sudden to go into the celebration and the kindling of the new fire. Now, I don't know how much time we have left.
Well, you're good. We got about 20 minutes.
Okay, so does anybody else have comments at this point?
Well, I'm going to throw out there that I would disagree that Frigg and Mother Holle were the same. I think that people are very, especially Christians, are fond of conflating any goddesses that have things in common. And but Mother Holle was completely different, as those of us who've dealt with her are willing to say. And one of the things that her particular hunt was often said to be, she had the babies. She had the children who Christian times hadn't been baptized, but in the pre-Christian times, the children who'd been exposed, they hadn't been accepted, and therefore they were. And so she had all these souls of these children who'd been denied life by their parents, and boy, were they dangerous. Oh, Griffin has something. Go, Griffin.
Yeah, the ghost child, or the dead child ghost, was one of the most terrifying beings. For example, if you were walking along and you heard what sounded like a child's crying behind you or off to the side, you would say, I name you, girl's name, boy's name. And in Christian times, you would say, I baptize you, boy's name, girl's name. And so that the soul could go to the in-between lands or go to heaven. So, there was that, but the dead child, that was a very terrifying thing. And they had the various spells to bind those, where they had buried the stillborns and the ones that had been exposed. And in Borgenstave Church, above, there was a rafter above where they buried these little bodies, and then the Thisteel, Misteel, Kisteel spell on that, which was to prevent them. It was sort of Thisteel, thistle seeds, but this is Zen number of thistle seeds, so it's strewn all around. Misteel, mistletoe. This is the battery pack powering the spell. And because mistletoe is believed to have been planted in the trees by the passage of the supernatural thunderbolt. And then Kisteel means a strongbox, essentially, or casket. So essentially, that was a way of keeping them pent up. But then there were ways of working to free those. And we see the possibly in Tolkien, when the Barrow Wights, they were enclosed, and so it may have been a similar spell, but that's not really a Yule thing. Okay, we've got Odin's Hunt and Holle have the same origins, however, yeah. It is a time where the souls, and then the thing went away. But yeah, but there was also a Perchta, and then there was an evil Perchta. So there were the good side and the bad side. So, but Frau Holle or Holda was one of the ones that was called to have been riding on the wild hunt. But then, so that was the one season shot. And then she was the hostess with the mostest, Martha Stewart would be jealous of her abilities. She wanted a clean house and minding children. Any other questions? Because we've pretty much gone through.
Griffin had something he was going to.
Well, I just had a small observation. We talked about color, and I know that colors were very important. And you pointed out that the ancestor of Santa Claus actually wore green, not red. And for some reason, it just popped into my head that when I learned the German version of "O Christmas Tree," the first line stresses, "How green are thy leaves?" Not how lovely are thy branches. Wie grün sind deine Blätter.
Blätter is leaves, yes.
And the fact that they stressed, "A Christmas tree, how green are your leaves?" It's like they're pushing the concept of green, which is probably important in the dead of winter.
Yeah, and also bringing greens into the house, which well predates Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And bringing the Christmas tree in, or the Yule tree in, and decorating with green. And like I have, green thing up on my front door. And
Well, that's
then I
that
got the poinsettia.
They hold more life energy. So anything that
And-
stays green through the winter has all that life energy. So your holly, your ivy, your moss, rosemary,
Anything evergreen.
and pine, right? So it has that life energy, and that's why they bring it in the wintertime to help, bring back the spring.
Yeah, bring the sun back and bring the good weather back, the spring, the planting. And so the animals will, like the cows will get pregnant, the sheep, ewes will get pregnant, and so that the new life will come. So it is also a time for new life as well. And it's interesting that the modern Christmas, they say, was the birth of Jesus, but Jesus was probably born in lambing time, which is probably around March. And but you see, Mithras in the Roman cult Mithraism, Mithras emerged from a lumpy rock on 25th December. And he was linked with Sol Invictus, or the unconquerable sun. And so this is where when he emerged, so that he could perform the Tauroctony, he brought the light of Sol Invictus on the lit torch that when he emerged from the stone, so that he could light the torch of Cautes and Cautopates. Cautes held his torch up, Cautopates held his torch down. So one would be beginnings or spring, and one would be endings and fall. So you would have the seasons coming. So you have so much to do with the coming of the light. And but you see, it's like many pagan temples, particularly in Norway, they would build the Christian church right on top of it. And in Norway, magic was supposed to flow from the north, not from the east. And so the prekestolen, which is the pulpit, the preacher would be in that. And that was always positioned in the north of the church. So the magic would flow over him and down to the congregation. And in another temple, they had the Norse gods, Thor in the center, because the thunderbolt wielder was usually the primary male celestial deity. And then on one side, it would be like Frey, And on the other side, depending on your location, it could have been one of the sea gods like Njord or Aegir, or someone with that was linked with cattle or whatever. But you would have those in the north, and then on the east side, you would have Jesus, which was Jesus, and Sancta Maria, Saint Mary on one side, and then somebody else. Frequently, it was a saint called Saint Botolph, and I don't know who Saint Botolph was a saint of, but I guess he was a wicked character or a defender. Sometimes Saint Michael, but so you could go to one or the other. So conversion in some areas was a lot friendlier. In other areas, not so friendly. Like there was one king. There was this wonderful little poem about.
Botolph was a saint of boundaries, not unlike Janus. And
Okay. In other words, okay. I'm unfamiliar with the saints. I wasn't really raised Christian. Like we were, as my mom called us, blue domers for the blue heavens. And we would rather be out sailing or something and enjoying the good earth. So we were not, we had introduction to Christianity and introduction to Judaism and etc. But it was not our faith.
Oh, my enjoyment of the saints and the other Christian myths is entirely adult gathered, because I think they're very cool. But
and it's interesting, the Swedish Sancta Lucia, the Lucia, where the girls would dress in white with a red sash around their middle and have a crown with candles. And now you can have like battery operated candles, and they bring saffron buns. And I've got your recipe, Chipicon, for those wonderful saffron buns. Incidentally, her cookie book is awesome. And so I'm making saffron buns from that. And in the night, would come up and bringing the light. But Lucia was a Roman saint or Christian saint, but the Lucia was a earlier form of a supernatural being. And I don't know too much about the Lucia, but it was certainly not really Christian.
Allison, I got a hand up from Allison. Go, Alice. Unmute yourself.
I was just thinking about how much the smith fire is like the Celtic need fires that they would make at Samhain and Beltane, where they would put out all the fires and you had to make fire with friction. You weren't allowed to make it with anything else.
There are different ways of making the fire. The most elaborate one, of course, is the smith pounding on the metal. But yes, friction, and also flint and steel. And in one of the journals that I have, is a journal called Skalk, I think that's the Danish one. And back even in Stone Age times, they used iron pyrite and flint, because they have found cubes of the pyrite, because it forms in a cube form, as well as a splat form and a chispa, which is a chunky form, and where it's been stroked. So creating fire is a magical thing, and this would have to be the ceremonial fires. We'll look at people lighting candles in churches. And but the need fires and the fires where they'd lit two of the fires side by side and put certain herbs on it and send the cattle through so that the smoke would go over them and protect them. They didn't do that in Norway, but okay.
I was just thinking the whole community, it would be such an act of faith that the spring is returning to turn every fire off. because there are a couple of fairy tales I know that where village or a house is suffering from not having a fire. It would be like a horrible fear that everybody would have that.
You could
Yeah,
die.
and Laska, you know
Yeah.
a lot of the Slavic traditions. What are some of the
Mhm.
Slavic traditions? Did you have the equivalent of the wild hunt?
No, I would have to look because like I wasn't aware of it until I attended Chipikan's class at Penzek. So, but it might be just something I personally never heard about. So I can look into it for you. That's why I wanted to see that those Russian text you were looking at. I'll contact you after the class about that.
Yeah, there are two different examples in Slavic lands of
Oh,
like the
yay.
wild hunt. I think it's in Bulgaria, which isn't technically Slavic, but the traditions are sort of the same. Um, it has to do with a horseman, these horsemen that are like melded with their horse. So they're not centaurs, but they're melded onto the back of their horse. And they also, go around doing destruction and whatnot. Um, and there was another example, and now I'm blanking on it. In
Well, I've
Slavic
got the
lands.
Polish was Ziki Lov, Dziki, then the L with a slash on it, O with an accent on it, W. Then there's a bunch of Cyrillic, and then was the Belarusian wild hunt, and Divya, Divja, Yaga, Jaga, Slovene, the wild hunting party.
Yeah.
And so
Divya Yaga, would be like Baba Yaga, sort of.
oh, Baba Yaga. Oh, now that's another one. I've got a friend who's building a Baba Yaga hut on top of these
I
tree
think
trunks that look
that's
like chicken feet.
Patricia.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm building a Baba Yaga hut too.
Well, Jane, one of the things that popped into my mind as we were talking about is, first of all, it does sound like this business of extinguishing the fires and starting new ones is a fairly widespread tradition throughout Europe. And the other thing is, I realized that given the times and the technology, it was certainly an act of faith because it was really risky for an entire village to put out every fire, and especially the Smith's fire, which never goes out. And that's kind of profound. So
I don't
Yeah, but
I don't
this
think it's
is
quite
really
as I don't think it's quite as risky as you think. It's pretty easy to start a fire from a spark.
If you're used
If
to it.
if
Yeah.
you have the
well,
tinder,
yeah,
And
Yeah, if you're-
making that act, making the fire sacred from
Right.
Yeah.
scratch is a very good way of enshrining that knowledge. Like, this is important. Wait, pay attention. You have to know
Right.
how to do this.
and the real thing is that it's a very concrete way to actualize the concept of death and rebirth, because the old fire dies and a new fire
Mhm.
must be born. And this is very convenient because this way nobody actually has to die to do this. But symbolically, it's kind of huge.
Well, it
Because they can-
reinforces that knowledge,
Yeah,
and it makes it hard to rely on the concept of go borrow a coal from an ember from the neighbor.
yeah.
and there are lots of those stories.
Yeah.
That where they'd walk 3 to 5 miles to get a coal from the neighbor, because if you don't have it, you can
Mhm.
die. So
yeah, and then look at the modern tradition at New Year's. You've got the old man with a sickle, and the
Mhm.
new one with is the baby. So again, you have the old and the new, and so Yule, which is the solstice, this is the time of the change
Mhm.
and beginning, in new beginnings.
Mhm.
Any other questions? I have thrown up a couple of links. I'll get the handout to my wild hunt thing, which is on my website. And I highly recommend Claude Lecoteau's book on the Phantom Armies of the Night, which is about the wild hunt, and he is like the preeminent folklorist of our time. And so we are closing in. So
Starwolf,
this is where we're going to be talking about thanking Jane for coming on. Always exciting to have Jane with us because she likes studying. And,
Oh, I love studying.
and sharing the information with us, which is why Jane and I started changing times. Gee, what a surprise. Okay. Taking a quick look. Does anybody else have
Let's start off.
a hand up?
well, I just
there?
gotta say, I gotta get studying here because I'm embarrassed to say that my father was Slovak, and I don't know anything about the mythology of his homeland. So you get cracking on that.
Well, during
I run a Facebook group, The Roots of Slavic Magic,
yes,
and
definitely go
share
there.
a lot of information on that.
There's some great stuff on Roots of Slavic Magic, and I know you're on Facebook, so something I want to pass on almost every day, but most of it isn't shareable. So anyway, so thank you, Jane, and thank you everybody for coming. And we are going to have, let's see, next week, I think it's Chris Croucher who is doing he's telling us about, he has a special ritual for the longest night. And I think he's going to be doing that. And after that, I've got, who have I got? And this is why I write them down so I don't have to remember them.
It's in a real safe
Oh,
place.
no, next week, Arkenstone's doing lucid dreaming.
Oh, that could be.
Then there's
Ah,
that
then
would be
there's the-
interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And as I said, this is a great self-indulgence for me. So, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And I guess it's time for me to
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, and
if we're
incidentally,
seeing-
Patricia Woodruff wrote a wonderful book on the Slavic deities, and I love that book.
Yep.
Thanks, Jane.